People share stories, and I believe everyone has just incredible stories within them that can help other people. So the podcast came from a place of wanting to get to and tell other people's stories to help people who can hear them. And that was how Flip Your Script started.
Welcome to Flip Your Script, the podcast about life's critical turning points and how people find the inspiration and motivation to move forward and rewrite their unique stories. Flip Your Script is produced by Minefield, a public relations firm passionate about the power of sharing stories. Specializing in earned and social media, Minefield helps clients take control of their unique story and message. The show is hosted by Kristi Piehl, founder and CEO of Minefield, who flipped her script from an Emmy-winning journalist to a successful entrepreneur and speaker.
Welcome to a special edition of the Flip Your Script podcast. After over a year, we're at our 50th episode, and we're doing something really different. The team decided the best way to celebrate the 50th episode was with an actual Flip Your Script on me. And I have no idea how it happened actually, but Meagan Millage, who's the director of the growth team at Minefield, was somehow nominated by someone else to be the person to ask me questions. And so I'm the guest today. Welcome, Meagan.
Isn't that how the best things work? You get nominated. This is great. So we're really excited. I mean, we're going to look back on 50 episodes, 49 guests. We're going to talk a little bit about how the podcast was started, your Flip Your Script story. So we have a lot of good questions today. Listeners submitted their questions, so we'll get to those as well. But I want to start by talking about a question that you hear a lot, and that's, why are you doing a podcast?
We didn't start with our cheers, Meagan.
Oh my gosh, how could we forget?
We're not used to drinking and podcasting, so here we go. Cheers to 50.
Cheers to 50, 1 year in.
Great. Okay, so the question is, why did we start doing the podcast? So it started in November of 2019. Episode number 47 was an episode where Julia Waller, who is one of the co-leaders, founders of the Unique Ability Concept with Strategic Coach. And I was with her when the podcast really became became an idea and it became real. So that was November of 2019. And I was in Toronto with Julia Waller. And the problem we were trying to solve was, as a co-founder of a business, the concept that if you lean into your unique ability and really spend more time doing tasks and things that really fill you up and that only you can do, really good things happen. So as part of a really intense and sort of difficult 2 days, the concept for the podcast started. And I knew before I left Toronto and came back to Minneapolis that this podcast was going to be real. The purpose was simply to share people's stories. As a trained journalist and former reporter, I love stories. My entire life, I've been having people tell me stories in strange places. I think one of my kids has that gift or curse. I'm not sure, depending upon it. So people share stories, and I believe everyone has just incredible stories within them that can help other people. So the podcast came from a place of wanting to get to and tell other people's stories to help people who can hear them. And that was how Flip Your Script started.
Right. And I think anyone who knows you knows that for some reason you do have that gift. I'm calling it a gift, not a curse. People just tell you things. They want to tell you their story. And we talk about this theme, and it's Flip Your Script. And so you did the work to kind of dig in and figure out, I want a podcast. I want to share stories. Did it come from your own Flip Your Script moment, or why this theme?
I knew that people all have struggles. And I think in the realm and land of social media, it's very easy to look at other people and believe that they either have no troubles or somehow have a Cinderella type of life. And I realized that based on what my life looks like on the outside, people could think that about me and my family. And I'm an open book. I always have been. And it hasn't always been easy. And so often, and I read a lot, which we talk about on the podcast. And most people's stories go from this hard thing happened, and then let me tell you about the happy ending. And I think we're missing the middle part, and the middle part is the struggle. And the middle part of that is, how did you wrestle through some stuff to get to, and happy ending probably isn't fair. How did you get to the other side and look back on the struggle and say, I'm glad that happened. I wish it didn't, but I'm glad it did because it made me who I am. And that's how I feel about some of the struggles in my life. And the podcast came from a place of let's spend more time giving people tools so they know when they're going through something, they're not alone and they can get through it. And it's really about mindset. So that was the part of the flip your script concept that resonated with me that I thought would help other people.
You talk a lot on the podcast about other people's flip your script stories. And if anybody who follows you on social media or has seen, any of your interviews, they know a little bit of your flip your script story from, you just mentioned in the beginning, a trained journalist. You're all about stories. But now you're the CEO of this company. So talk a little bit about your flip your script story, the big one, and kind of that in between, that struggle that you talk about just now that nobody really talks about. They like to talk about the happy ending. Your happy ending, we can all see it, but what was that kind of flip your script moment and that struggle for you?
I talk about the flip your script in general, and because I feel like I have to do here what I ask my guests to do, I'll get deeper into it. So, and the parts that, not that I don't talk about, that just don't usually come up. So I lost my job. I was a TV reporter at the ABC station in Minneapolis in late 2008. I had a couple of stories I was still working on. So my last story aired in February of 2009, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I really realized that my identity was completely wrapped up in being a TV person in a really unhealthy way. And I knew the minute I lost my job that it was a blessing, and I called it that immediately. It was a shock. We were negotiating, my agent was negotiating my next contract. It came out of the clear blue sky. I had just won some Emmys. I mean, it was not at all anything I was expecting. So it knocked me off my feet. And I knew immediately, because my sons at the time were young, we weren't going to move again for TV, which I had done, and we had done, and it was wonderful, but not anymore. And I also knew that I didn't want to work for someone else and give up flexibility. I had spent too many kids' birthdays, holidays, chasing tornadoes and fires and putting my life second. And I knew I didn't want to do that anymore. And I didn't know of any companies, especially in PR or media relations, where family came first. So I didn't think that was an option for me. So I got stuck in this place. I also believed I had done some things ethically as a journalist that didn't sit well with me. And I had lied to my news director on more than one occasion because I wasn't going to do what he was asking me to do. And I don't lie. So I felt to some degree that I had to, and this is too strong, but atone for my sins and figure out a way, right?
People who come from newsrooms probably know what you mean.
You've done it.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. You do some things where you're like, but okay. So nothing criminal. Like, just let's be clear.
No, it's just not you. I don't lie. Like this is who I am as a person. And in no way in TV were you lying to viewers or the public, but there are things that happen in a newsroom that aren't necessarily healthy.
That's an excellent way to say it. Excellent way to say it. So for me, I knew that I wanted to keep working. I also knew that I hadn't stepped back and looked at my life and thought, what should I do now? And it was looking back, and I never went to a physician, and I probably should have. I've done therapy since. But right afterwards, I would wake up in the middle of the night and it felt like someone was sitting on my chest. I would say now that's probably panic attack, anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I didn't talk to someone about it, should have, but I didn't know who I was, is the reality. So during the next 18 months, I first went and started doing volunteer work, and it was financially a struggle. I was on unemployment. I was on unemployment for quite some time because I didn't know what my next thing was. And I also knew that I didn't want to do traditional public relations. So I didn't see a clear path. And I talked about at the time, I wanted to use my gifts for good because I really believed that this storytelling, I knew that there was something there that could help people. And I knew that I thought about things in a really different way, but I didn't know where to take that.
Right.
And there was a day, I remember it very well. I remember it's the only time in my entire life, and I'm sure sometime in the future it'll happen again. I was on my knees on my kitchen floor crying. I had no idea. I had no idea what the path forward would be because I didn't know me. And so the next 18 months, it was about me figuring out me around my, what I call my non-negotiables, my family. So I had this beautiful time with my kids. I took a very part-time job at my church because they said, hey, we need someone to do the church bulletin. You know how to write, don't you?
Yep.
Sure do. And that was, 12 hours a week. It was lovely. And I just said yes to a lot of things I need to help people. And it was from, I gotta use the gifts for good. So after 18 months of struggle, and it's when I learned to garden. I don't do it anymore because I don't have time, but that was my therapy. My kids were taking naps. I'd be in the backyard, and it was a rebirth for me. And my husband was traveling a lot at the time. So it was this, I talk about it now like a soldier that you like boot camp. You break them all the way down and you build her all the way up.
Yep.
And that's what it was for me.
And going through that and talking about your struggle and the mindset. So you just said it's all about mindset, right? Your mindset, then how has that helped you with dealing with struggle since, right? Media Minefield, we're going on 11 years. So it's been almost 11 years since you started the company. We can't sit here and say it's been like rainbows and unicorns the whole time. So, dealing with that bigger moment, how has that struggle helped you with any smaller struggles or flip your script moments since that day?
That time taught me a few things. What really matters. And what really matters are my family. I have close friends. I have my faith. I know that I'm okay. And so if the one thing that was my identity ever goes away again, I'm okay. And it put that in perspective for me. It also put in perspective for me, if I can get through that, I can do anything. And this business started in the basement of my church. And I've talked about it before. This wasn't my idea. I really believe that God gave me this idea, and I'm shepherding it. And the fact that this wasn't my idea, I never said, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur. The fact that this wasn't my thing, I'm holding it a lot looser than if I had this business plan for the last 10 years and have been working on it. I didn't. I took a class. I walked out. I said, I'm starting a business. Here's the name. Here's what we're doing. Let's go. And that's what it was. So that has helped me to that mindset that things change. Nothing is guaranteed. And it's all about how you navigate the struggles and the evolution and how you come out the other side. And I'm so grateful I lost my job. And there are people in my life who need to lose their jobs because they need to do the hard work of figuring out what they're on this planet to do. And many people are really defined by a title or a dollar amount or a whatever. And had I stayed in TV, I wouldn't be who I am today.
Right. And I think we talk a lot at Media Minefield about hiring journalists, right? We hire trained journalists. So I remember coming to Media Minefield for a job interview, and I think it was you showing me around the office, and I said, this feels like rehab for journalists. Like, it feels like your identity is very wrapped up in that profession, and making any sort of a career shift, no matter what it is jarring. So not everybody you're talking to on the podcast is making a career shift. They didn't all lose their jobs. They've had a variety of flip your script moments. So in thinking back on those 49 people that you've now talked to, what has been some of the most surprising things you've heard from their flip your script moments?
Meagan, I would say the podcast saved my mental health in the pandemic. And the funny thing about so many things in life, I thought I was doing the podcast for other people. The podcast has helped me. And it's because whether I'm talking to someone who has lived through a terrible tragedy, whether their loved one was murdered or they switched jobs or they had their business burned down or they found out they were adopted, like all these different stories that seem to have not that much in common, the mindset of the people is so similar. They talk a lot about attitude. They talk about gratitude. These themes are a thread that goes through the majority of the stories, and they're so different, which really proves the point from the beginning that the key to dealing with struggle is mindset. And it's learning to rely on other people, having relationships, having perspective. And I am so glad that this thing happened during the pandemic because I had the capacity and the time. I wasn't traveling. I was at home. I could do this. I didn't, again, at the end of the podcast, I always talk about you're capable more than you think. I had no idea I could do a podcast. No idea. And here we are. And granted, many, many people have helped. You're part of the team. Many people, which we'll shout them out at the end, many people have helped. So it isn't a one-woman show by any mean. But at the beginning, my son put together the microphones because it wasn't safe to have other people in the house to do it.
Right.
So it has been an adventure, and the podcast is going to keep going because we've had so much good feedback, but it will always be something that started in this time. And listening to these stories week after week, it couldn't help but change me too.
And I think 2020 put a unique perspective around the podcast. You talked about, it wasn't the plan, like COVID didn't hit and you're like, let's start a podcast and share stories. Like, so it gave you a unique lens to view these stories through. And actually that leads us to a good listener question. This is from Bill Danko, guest number.
I have it right here. Bill Danko is guest number 45.
45. Okay, so in 2015, if you were going to ask somebody what he or she would be doing in 5 years, so 2020, there would be a lot of broken dreams, right? Like anything people said in 2015, I want to be doing this in the next 5 years, it probably didn't happen. So where do you see yourself in 5 years, assuming we don't have to cope with a worldwide pandemic? And I want to ask you, where do you see the podcast in 5 years? Yourself and the podcast.
Bill is one of these people who I just met, and he's on the podcast, and his book is sitting here. He was the author of Millionaire Next Door and Richer Than a Millionaire, which is the book we have here. So shout out to Bill. Regarding the podcast, I believe we will be putting out content in the flip your script message in some fashion. Will it be this podcast? Will it be another podcast? Will it be a show? Will it be on some platform that hasn't been invented yet? I don't know. I do believe that right now we've found a topic that resonates with people and that helps people, and that stories have power, and we will continue to play in that space in some fashion. On the personal side, I have found that there's a big difference between a purpose and a profession. And when I lost my job, I really found the difference between purpose and profession. And I have all the plans in the world to be running this company and speaking out about the issues that are important as it relates to public relations, as it relates to media, as it relates to entrepreneurship and women in business, and those things that are important to me and that I'm passionate about. So I have every intention in continuing there and continuing to run the company. However, I've been around long enough to know that the best laid plans can change. And so I hold my plans loosely. However, I do have every intention to still be operating in a place where I'm in my purpose area and not just in a profession, because the joy and the fulfillment and the satisfaction comes in that purpose place. And that's where I want to be in 5 years. I also know that in my personal life, things will be different because I will have, God willing, one child out of college, one other child in college. So I will be in that empty nest phase of life, which I'm looking forward to. I don't want to rush it, but I really want to find joy in every stage of my life, personally and professionally. And I certainly hope that when my children go, and my plans are that when my children leave the home, I'll have more capacity, my husband and I will, to give back and to make impact and to make a difference. Because at the end of the day, I believe that's what I'm here to do.
It's harder now to predict these sort of things after the last year we've had. And thinking about, I mean, back when you started planning the podcast, it was never the plan to be in your basement. And just recently now, you've been able to move out of your basement.
We moved from the dog's bedroom, which is so funny. We've moved into this house a couple of years ago, and the dog had always slept in our bed. And so we got a king-size bed so the dog would have some space. And we go to bed the first night in the new house, and the dog walks up the steps, and he turns the left to go into the guest room where our old bed was. And he has never slept in our bed. He sleeps in the guest room on his bed. Like, he's got his own room. Boba Fett has his own room. And now that has been where I did the podcast, because we could close the door. It was quiet. It worked well. And it wasn't until this week when I moved everything back to the office. And here we are.
So even the podcast has evolved over the past year, just like all of us. So thinking about the past year, the past 49 episodes, what's been like the one thing that's really stood out, that whether it's the guests or the podcast itself, whether it's realizing that you can do technical things, like
who knew?
Putting the microphones together, what has it taught you? What is your big lesson from the last year?
Couple of things. For me personally, telling stories, sharing stories, and being in front of a microphone fills me up. And I had forgotten that. And Unique Ability taught me that. I've also found that we've inspired people. It works. There's listeners that listen every week. There's people who have sent these notes in, and I think we're really helping people. And I suspect that there are people who hear some of these that have no idea. I will never know how we've impacted people, and that's great. I don't need to know, but if someone shares a story that helps someone else or makes their path easier, check. We've accomplished what we set out to do. It also has, I think, taught me, and from the business part of it, this podcasting thing, it's like a real thing, and it makes a difference, and it's a real business, and it has impact. And I never saw myself as someone who would join this movement and have something to say. And doing this podcast every week means I got to figure out where I stand. And I think these guests all come on and have a bold idea of who they are and what they want to say and what they stand for and what message they want to send. And that's a great way to live.
Okay, a few things there. So talking about the people who have said, this one episode really inspired me, or we've had that feedback. We've had comments. You've heard it personally. We've had emails about people just saying like, hey, this episode or this podcast as a whole has inspired me. So that's one way to track impact, right? And we have a listener question of how do you measure the reach and impact of your podcast? Like, what does that look like to you? Is it the ratings? Is it just the feedback you're getting? Is it just hearing that one story about somebody saying, this helped me?
I can easily say, for me, having one person say that we impacted them is enough. However, it is a business. There are a lot of people spending their time and energy on it, and I'm not naive enough to think we don't have to have metrics and have to prove some things. So when this whole thing started, I had to come back basically and make a business case to my executive team. I'm going to spend time like this. I need this amount of time from a whole bunch of people to do this. We need a logo. We need creative. We're going to launch a podcast, and perhaps we could launch other people's podcasts, but we need to figure this out. And so it started with the idea that let's see what happens. Let's figure this out and see what happens. A lot of our clients are interviewed on podcasts, so we know how they work, but we hadn't produced one. So there was that piece of it that I knew would be valuable. The other part of this is that I've been shocked who we've been able to get on this podcast. I've learned so much about people will do this and they will share their stories. And then I've made friends from guests that were on the podcast that we've stayed in touch with, which is kind of crazy and has put me in the realm of people that I didn't think would want to talk to me. And they're inviting me to speak at their stuff. And it's really cool. So there has been that element. And we made the decision early on not to seek advertisers or sponsors. Now, I'm not saying we never would do that, but initially it really was about sharing stories. It still is, of course. But it wasn't how can we monetize this? Right. However, I did have up on my wall until a couple of months ago, the goal of the podcast was for 2020 to get 2020 downloads.
This is what I wanted. Yeah, the goal. And then you got merch.
And then I wanted merch.
Yeah.
And I wanted 2020.
No advertisers. Who needs advertisers? We just want merch.
It's the little things. Those sweatshirts are awesome, though.
Yeah, they
have
are.
to say.
The notebooks, the sweatshirts, it's all great.
Yeah, we have good merch. So the 2020 downloads, I thought, boy, that sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
And that's and I firmly believe you can't be successful if you don't put some kind of measurement on and say we did that.
Yeah.
So it started with 2020 and we got 2,020 downloads in like a few months. So I knew we were onto something. So we accomplished the numerical goal, and I'm seeing a lot of business outcomes. And when I do news interviews or when I'm out there talking about things, saying "and a podcast guest" is sort of a big deal, which is funny because everyone has a podcast. But it means something to people. And I personally love the platform because it's long form storytelling.
So do you have any goals moving forward? Have you set new goals? Are you looking like you did it? We're a year in, you're 50 episodes in. What's the next big goal?
Well, Holly, who's the executive producer, knows I have the dream list of guests. Yep. So she, I know, is always working on that. So they're coming. You know, I don't have a download goal anymore because we achieved one and I don't want to just keep setting the next one. So it's tell more stories, share more stories, help more people. I do think that there is going to be something between now and the next 50 episodes that happens that catapults us a bit. I have that sense, and I'm starting to talk to some people. So I think that this is going to have a larger reach. I just don't know what that looks like, and I'm not seeking that out.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we go back and talk about the first 49 episodes that got us here. And we've talked about this a little bit, right? There's like there's those first people who really, they had to believe in it. We had nothing to show for it. You couldn't say like, hey, I have this podcast, listen to a few episodes. Do you want to be on it? It's just like, believe in me and trust me. So I know you kind of have your guests, you hold them all in a special place differently. But I want to talk about maybe those first 10 that you recorded, the first dozen, and how that felt, what that was like, and how it's different now.
The beginning of the podcast felt very much like hiring the first employees because it wasn't really real yet. It was, believe in me, here's my dream, want to join me? And when people share their stories, you're asking them to share a really personal, really vulnerable part, and they can't listen to an episode to see what it would be like to be interviewed by you. And so these first 9-10 people are people who were connected to me in some fashion, who I knew they had pretty amazing stories, and many of them had never told them before. And I had to, some of them, really convince them, really trust me. And now Chris Maxon, who came out as episode number 8, he was actually the first person I ever interviewed. And it was April 1st, because I remember it was April Fool's Day, and he had never shared his story. I had never done a podcast before as the, interviewer. And it was the launch of Flip Your Script. And what I found out about doing that is that he has thanked me because it allowed him to share a part of his story that he had never done, and it helped people. And people around him said, thank you for talking about it. And it made an impact. And because of those first 10, 12, then more people could go to the website, believe that it was real, they could listen to it, and we could start getting strangers on board. And it has been remarkable.
Looking at your strangers list. So, I mean, there's been big people. So you're looking at the first 10, 12. There's your mentor, Chris, who's in an entrepreneurs group with you, Michelle, who's an employee here, one of our coworkers. So former coworkers of yours. So it really was this close group of people you knew. And then you expanded outside of that to Arshay Cooper, authors, Janice Kaplan. We have a bunch of books here from different authors.
All from the Flip Your Script podcast. Pretty cool.
Laura Sobiak. I mean, these bigger names of people who you might know or have heard of, but you didn't know personally. How is interviewing those people different than the people you knew?
It's easier to interview people you don't know because a couple of reasons. One, I can do the research, and Holly prepares a lot of great research, and I can look at them and have an understanding of where their story, I'd like to take their story. And it feels a little bit like it's research, and it's similar to what I did in TV, but in a different format. And I can think about where I want to take that episode. When I interview friends or people who I know have trusted me with a piece of them they haven't shared before, it feels heavier to me. I feel like I have to do right by them. And I also have to add, for the people listening, I have to add context because it's very easy to like do an inside joke. Like, well, no one knows what you're talking about. So it is a little bit harder. I have to think harder because I have to assume that the people listening have no idea about this. So I have to treat them like a stranger, even though I know their story.
So there's been guests that have been, you and Holly will tell us, so-and-so is going to be on this week. And the one I didn't know because I don't know TikTok, Dogface, the Ocean Spray guy. I totally knew it after we talked about it. But are there guests like that you hear from, like, say your kids who are like, oh, this is so cool. Like, do they have a favorite? Because I know what you're going to say for your favorite, but do your family, your friend, does anyone else in your life have a favorite episode or a favorite guest that they've heard?
They do. People have different favorites. And I've had people tell me they'll go back and listen to different episodes based on what the message is and what they sort of need in their life. My youngest son will not subscribe or become a subscriber until we get an NBA player. So that is an ongoing situation because he says he will start listening to every single one when we get an NBA player. So that is on my long-term list.
At the NBA.
At the NBA. Tell your friends. And I've been really surprised at which ones resonate. So I believe up until now, Michelle Lawless's episode is one of our most listened to. And she's someone who, her story, very personal, something she's never talked about before, has really resonated with people. People listen to it week after week. Matt and Sloan, they were a couple that my kids showed me on TikTok. And they didn't show me because of the podcast. They showed me months before and said, look at how cool this is. And Holly, or Christina, I believe, was producing at the time, maybe Holly, reached out. One of them reached out and said, hey, will you do this? And they said yes. And that's the first time Sloan had ever done an interview.
Right.
And it's really fun to interview people for the first time. And there's been quite a few of those folks who have done news interviews or done newspaper or print or something interviews, but have never done a podcast interview. And it feels whenever anyone shares a story, whether it's in an airplane or at the Starbucks line, whenever people share a story, that's such an honor. It's such a privilege. When someone shares a piece of their story with you, it's a privilege.
We have to ask, what is your favorite episode?
The next episode. It's always going to be the next
Right.
episode because it's just like, what vacation is your favorite vacation? The next vacation.
Yeah.
I just get so excited about all the stories. And I will say one that was the most probably fangirlish, hard to not go nuts with was Mike Del Judas. So Mike Del Judas is the piano player and one of the singers, main singer with Billy Joel. And I'm a crazy, weird Billy Joel fan. I don't have tattoos and I'm not planning. But if I was to get a tattoo, like
Maybe in 5 years.
Maybe.
It's where you see yourself in 5 years.
There you go, Bill Danko. A Billy Joel tattoo. No. So Mike Del Judas said yes. And then I asked him questions that he played on the piano. And so he did some singing on that episode. And that was such an interesting episode because of that. And the sound quality and how he sang, I had people reach out that it sounded like you were at a concert. And in the middle of the pandemic, we were hungry for concerts.
We wanted the music. Okay, so going back to what you were saying a little bit ago, you hear stories on a plane. When people share stories, they're sharing this very personal, it's a privilege to hear them. And anybody who knows you knows that you love a good plane conversation. So one of our listener questions, what's your most memorable random plane conversation, your most memorable story that you've heard unexpectedly?
So I have two. Can I share two?
Yep.
Okay.
No rules.
No rules. So one actually happened to me with me, and one I overheard. I also like to eavesdrop.
Oh, same. Yep. So who doesn't? If you say you don't, you're lying.
You're lying. So if you ever get on an airplane near me, I might be listening because people's stories are interesting, even if they're not intentionally telling them to me. If you're talking loud enough.
You want to know. You want to know about strangers. You want to know. It's a natural human curiosity.
Now, I will say I also hold eavesdropped conversations generally. I didn't tweet this. I'll do that one second. That's the most for sure interesting that's ever happened on an airplane. I'll tell you that one in a minute. And I do have a picture to go with it, but I won't put it out because someone could recognize these people. So how's that for a tease? So I had to take a picture because I didn't think anyone would believe me. the most memorable conversation I've ever had on an airplane that actually was with me. Eli was my 18-year-old now, was a little boy, and we were flying home. We were living in Ohio at the time. I was working in TV, and we're coming to visit family in Minnesota. And I was feeding him I was feeding him baby food. And so I had a spoon. And again, interesting. I just believe in general that we can always be better. Everything can be better. And I live my life through that filter. And so I had taken his baby spoons and heated them up and bent them so that they would have a better angle.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was doing that and feeding him, and the gentleman next to me started talking to me, and we were having a conversation, and he said that he was an executive with a baby food company, and he wondered if he could take the spoon and consider a patent and reach back out to me. I gave him the spoon. I said, here's my number. I don't know whatever happened with that, and I didn't ask for his number because I said, if you can help a baby, help a baby. But if you want to send me a check later, here's my address.
I'll take the money from this genius idea of mine. But
so that was one. The one that I overheard that is for sure the most interesting, which if your children are listening, I'm going to make this G-rated because we're a family-friendly podcast. I was sitting in the second row, and there was a man and a woman sitting in row 1. And they were talking kind of loud. They introduced each other. And I could see there was no one sitting next to me, so I could see between the seats. And they were drinking. And I don't count people's drink. I'm not a judgy flyer, but they were cocktailing. And I noticed it because they kept calling the person back, right? And so they shook hands. They introduced each other. They told interesting stories about where they had been. One had been doing mission work with the doctor. Another one was in corporate. And I just thought it was so interesting. So, of course, I'm trying to Google to figure out who these people are. And I couldn't because I didn't get quite enough information, but I was trying. So they start, after halfway through the flight, kissing. And I was like, I have never seen strangers.
Nope. Same.
So interesting. So then he's kind of rubbing her shoulders, and it was unusual. So I followed them off the plane, and they held hands and left together. So I've told this story because it's a really good story, and I have a picture, which again, I won't share. Were they a husband and wife or a couple who were role playing, or did they really just meet and leave together on an airplane?
I feel like we need to say what this flight was and what this date, listeners need to hunt this couple down, and we need answers. First of all, I love that they were cocktailing. I feel like I'm going to use that now. We're cocktailing right now.
Yes, we are.
When you're drinking. But I want to, can we give more details? Can people find? I feel like there are some detectives out there, some internet detectives. Somebody knows somebody. We have enough listeners. There are enough people who listen. We got to find out. How did you not have this strong desire to get more answers? I would have missed my connection.
I did, except what if they're married to other people? I can't ruin someone's life.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
I suspect, and most people have told me that they probably were a couple that thought that was exciting. But what if they
met? You hear these stories. People meet on airplanes. And what if you witnessed it?
Do you meet and make out and leave together? I mean, it wasn't a long flight. We were going from, I believe it was New York to Minneapolis. Is that long enough? I've been married for 25 years, so I don't know how this works, but it feels like it's not enough time. And they were probably between 45 and 55. I don't know. I mean, I'll leave it out there.
What a story, though. What a story. If this is really your story of how you met and they have a witness. Anyone knows anyone out there who met on a plane?
White couple, right? A couple 3 years ago, it was in the fall. And I would have that couple on this podcast.
Right. We need to hear the rest of their story.
Because it's fascinating. That's the part of that story right. And when I sat there, it wasn't like, I'm going to judge you. This is but I want the rest of the story. Where were you coming from? What's your background? Who are you with? It's so interesting.
Right.
People are interesting.
And this is where kind of the whole concept of the podcast came from, right? Storytelling. People are interesting. You've said it before, and it really sticks with people. Anybody you talk to, people talk a lot. It's so hard to talk, meet people and talk to them and learn about certain people if they're more closed off or not. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a flip your script moment. So we're looking back at 49 guests in the next 50 and the next 50. And it might be people that you, to your point from the very beginning, you see them on Instagram and you're like, they have a perfect life. But everyone has a story. So when you're thinking about that, when you're thinking about your guests or the people's stories you want to share, is there anything there that's like, no, do you ever think certain things are off limits, or there are certain stories you don't want to share? Or
we are intentionally a family-friendly podcast. So when people use language that would get us an E rating, we beep that out or remove it. So there are some stories that, well, they are valuable and important, this just isn't the right platform for them. So like the couple we talked about, I suspect both of them have really interesting stories. And if they're a couple and that was too exciting for them, that's a flip your script story, right? If they're people that met and were both cheating on their spouses, this is not the right platform for that. However, maybe in 5 years, there might be a place here. So again, it's this fine line of, we're not judging people's stories, but I know who the audience is. And I know what kind of stories will motivate others. And I don't want this to be a podcast where people are listening for the, gossipy factor. And those podcasts are out there and they're very good and there's a place for that. That just isn't what this is.
we're looking for the stories that are motivating or that are going to resonate and show you that, like, all of us can do hard things.
Everyone can do hard things. Everyone is capable of more than they think. Spoiler alert. Everyone has a struggle. Everyone has to get over things. And if you can get over whatever it is that comes your way and come out better, doesn't mean you have to like it. Doesn't mean there's joy in the moment, but come out better and find the good in it because it changes you. And if it can change you, the pandemic is a great example. Now, there are horrible things. People died. Horrible things happened. We're all coming out changed. And are there negative changes? Yes. But what were the positive changes? And if we can focus on what the good that came out of difficult things, we're survivors.
I think looking at the last year, everyone should be able to realize they can do difficult things. Is there anything in the last year with the podcast that you do differently?
That's a good question, Meagan. What would I do differently? I think every episode I've learned something. We've gotten better. There isn't. It's a learning process.
And your biggest hope for the next 50?
Help more people. Tell stories that are meaningful, that can help someone else. If everyone who hears a story has a positive impact and makes a positive impact, think of how many people can be impacted by one person's story. Share your stories. Doesn't mean you need a podcast, because all of my friends, all the people that I know have really important flip your script stories. Podcast, social media isn't the place for all of them. But don't keep things buried inside. Tell someone. It doesn't have to be from a billboard, but people who keep stories trapped inside of them have difficult lives.
There's power in sharing.
Every story has power. Stories are meant to be shared.
Okay, I want to end on one final listener question. You ask your guests for their favorite quote or lyric at the end of each episode, so we have to ask you, what is yours? What is that one quote that you find yourself going back to during hard times?
I have this quote in my home a couple places. I have it in a lot of different places, actually, because it means so much to me. It was motivating to me when I was unemployed. It was motivating to me as the company was starting, and it continues to motivate me as I think about the next 5 years and the next decade and whatever the next chapter is for me. And it's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Do not go where the path may lead. Go where there is no path and leave a trail. And I really want to leave a trail. And what it means to me is when you are going in, and I think about like The Woods, which also is the poem about, and I'm an English major, so take the road less traveled. But I think about going into the woods and the adventure happens on the unpaved trail. And if you can hack away some big, tall vines and you can cut down a tree, and the people who come after you, if it's easier for them, then you've done your job. And that is what that quote means to me, because I don't want to do life alone. And for some reason, I'm a leader and I get to lead and people follow. And if people are going to follow me, I want it to be as easy as possible for them. And I love an adventure. I love a plane ride. So if that trail, I got to get to the trail on a plane, right? So that is the quote that continues to motivate me.
Good. So we flipped your script on this episode.
Many more episodes to come. Thank you, Meagan, for sitting in the hot seat. Again, you, I think, got the worst job today. I appreciate it. And so many people have helped us. Christina and Heidi and Lindsay and Chris and Mary and Holly and Studio Americana and many, many people within the company, and Carrie, and just a lot of people have helped. This is not a one-person production. And it wouldn't be where we are without all of those people. If you have stories, send them to us. All people that have shared their stories, the 49 people, the books that are sitting up here on this table, the authors, thank you. It's a privilege that you've shared your story with me. And I don't take that lightly. And I really look forward to the next story. And my hope, I say it all the time, with every story that you hear on this podcast, is that you're empowered to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also check out flipyourscriptpodcast.com for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and information about our other great episodes.